Hello and welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage, on the last Saturday morning in October 2024. What a beautiful October it's been here in the Northeast. Northern lights, beautiful foliage, blue skies and sunshine nearly every day. Pretty lucky. Taking advantage this morning while it's quiet, repairing a Powerglide for somebody else and continuing to work on my SFI case Powerglide. This one is in a reed case, Powerglide case. Mine's in a BTE case, but they have a lot of similarities strength-wise. But speaking of strength, there's always a comparison between the Powerglide and the Turbo 400. The Powerglide is always going to be weaker, just the way they're designed. For instance, the output shaft is long and only 27 spline TH350 size, so the diameter is smaller and it's longer. Now, it's not the weakest point, probably seldom even breaks, even in stock form. So the weakness in stock form would be the planetary gear set. 1.76 was a V8 Powerglide, probably good for 400 or 500 horsepower. Ratings, again, are always based on the trifecta of traction, weight, and horsepower or torque. And when they combine to overpower whatever metal pieces between it and infinity, well, that's when problems start. So the high gear drum and clutches in a Powerglide, when the clutches are 5 inches in diameter, maybe a ½ inch wide. In aftermarket drums, you add more because that's your only defense. You can't make it physically larger without building a new transmission because it's not going to fit in the case. I mean, that's the beauty of a Powerglide. The parts are small, the whole transmission's lightweight, relatively durable. And we're going to talk about, most things are rated in horsepower. So from here on out, I guess we're going to talk, what the manufacturers rate things for horsepower. I have Powerglide videos in my playlist from a transmission I built a few years ago for the LS swapped turbo dot, and I broke down every section as I went, and I won't do that again on the Powerglide I'm building for myself. I've just been kind of highlighting it, but I have one video on input shafts where I started with the stock shaft and worked my way up to but not including the ringless shaft. All the shafts I compared were ring type. So what's the difference? Well, stock shafts, the spline is different. It's Powerglide only, and it's an easy conversion to put in a turbo spline Powerglide shaft. So that's what these all are. The catch is the Powerglide transmission never had a front stator bushing in the stator tube to support the input shaft. The bushing was in the torque converter, bush turbine. You need that if you're gonna put a turbo converter in your Powerglide, and you're way better off in a Turbo 400 to run a bush converter and lose the front stator bushing, because we're gonna be talking about oil flow today, which really becomes apparent with the different style shafts in the Powerglide, but the oil in and out of the converter all happens in and around the stator tube, and if you can remove a restriction, you're really going to help out thrust issues and converter performance and cooling, and everything's going to get happy. So I have videos about that in the Turbo 400 playlist. The stock Powerglide shafts were length specific for the ratio. 176 and 182 had different length input shafts, so that's how you could tell pretty easy what you had for a ratio. The aftermarket shafts got smart, and they kind of split the difference. They're all 12 3/4 long, and they fit anything. So who knew, right, that you could do that? Well, somebody smarter than me figured that out. So most all your aftermarket Powerglide shafts are going to be the same length. So we'll start with this guy. It's a Transmission Specialties 2520. It's a 4340 shaft. Good for well, I think it's listed at 850 horsepower. 4130 steel, I mentioned that. It is not set up for a stator bushing, which would ride here. It's necked right down for flow. It has 2 rings. Now the rings on a Powerglide shaft, you have oil returning from the converter. It hits the first ring, which seals in the stator tube, and sends oil out through the lower cooler fitting, or through the pump, through the case, out to the cooler. Through the cooler, comes back on the upper line, cooler line fitting on the side of the Powerglide, again, back through the case and the pump and all that, and hits the rear ring. It's caught in between the rings now, and there's a hole, lube hole, which is going to send oil. There's a exit hole here and an exit hole here, and it's going to lube high clutch drum, planetary set, everything in the back. That's the only way the transmission gets lubricating oil. There's some splash to, to the outside of the drum and the band. Pretty critical step. So again, oil comes in from the torque converter, out to the cooler, comes back in between the rings, is forced into the lube hole, and out to do its job. Unfortunately, that's a weak spot. They studied over the years that, the shaft's going to break right where the rings are. An old trick, like if you had a dump truck with a weak rear axle, we would cut a groove around the outside of the axle, so when it sheared it off, you could grab the axle piece and pull it out instead of breaking it way inside. Would create a weak point by grinding a ring in it. Sometimes the factory did that. The trick was to get a truck with a bigger rear axle, but hey, or a better driver. So the next shaft, this is an FTI. This is the one I'm actually putting in my transmission. It's rated for, I wrote on the box, 1100 horsepower. It's a 300M. It's physically, other than a few variances in spline length, it's listed as high flow right on the package. I assume they mean, how there's no stator tube bushing flat, because if it did, there'd be, an area where the oil couldn't flow. Still 2 rings, same lube holes, just better metal, better, stronger, ability to twist and bounce back without breaking. Whatever the properties between 4130 and 300M, there's a price difference of about $40. That one's, I believe, 120. This one's more than that. This one's 190. So you pay for the better metal, but again, this is rated 1100, and that's, factor in your numbers, it goes up or down from there. I've seen Powerglides with 300M shafts, rated for 1500 and up. So somewhere in that range, you're probably gonna, find the limits of it. Now let's get to the ringless shaft. Again, they found the weakness was right here. Somebody thought, hey, what can we do to have, get rid of the weak point and still get flow to the cooler and back? So, using parts they probably had laying around, specifically a Turbo 400 stator bushing, or inside a special stator tube, they machined it for 2 stator tube bushings from a Turbo 400, and they, not quite as efficiently as a nice Teflon ring or even a metal ring on a stock shaft, but there's 2 rings. I only got 1 bushing here, but there's 1 on either side of the lube hole, and oil's coming back, and it's going to hit the bushing and be, it's going to take the path of least resistance. Hopefully that's the cooler circuit. And same story on the way back, it's going to come back between the bushings and hopefully in the lube hole and do its job, because they still have the lube holes like we mentioned. So, but apparently dramatically stronger shaft without the rings cut into it. These are rated for up to 2,500, I believe, horsepower. That's, it's easy to say the number. It takes quite a bit to get that much power. So if you've got a ringless shaft Powerglide behind, most of the engines that me and my friends can afford, you're probably doing okay. Where do you go from here? Again, this is 300M, ringless shaft. That's what this transmission that's not mine has. you need a special stator tube and machining. You can machine a stock pump. You can buy, Sonex among others, has 2 style aftermarket stator tubes. I'm going to put a ring type in my stock pump when I rebuild it. And they weld them in on the back. I'll do the same. I pinned the last one. You can pin it or you can weld it. I'm just going to weld it this time because typically your pump failure is going to trash out. You won't be able to reuse the stator tube. So where do you go from here? You've got the best there is and you're still breaking it and you still want to run a Powerglide. Much like the Turbo 400, there's big shaft options. Powerglide also has big shaft options. And if you go to like the ATI website, we're talking 3,500 horsepower and up. Still running the Powerglide. They're talking alcohol funny cars and stuff like that. You can run a Powerglide. How they do that is they just make everything bigger. And when you make everything bigger, everything has to change. You need a bigger shaft, obviously, a bigger stator tube, which needs a bigger pump area to accept it, so none of that is going to be stock. And your planetary also has to change because this splines into it and they make everything bigger, so everything you have in your Powerglide you got to throw away pretty much. They make kits to do it, but you're pretty much buying everything because, you know, in a Powerglide there's not that many parts. You got, you know, the input shaft, high clutch drum, the planetary set, and a few pieces. That's all that's in there. And you're pretty much, you know, starting from scratch. If you really want to go that route, you can, or you can buy a big shaft transmission. And Turbo 400, same, it doesn't take quite as many parts. You don't have to get down in the lower section of the transmission anyway. But the option's there if that's what you have to run. So, and it's, I'm sure a lot of, I don't like the monster trucks and stuff, run a Powerglide. And there's a lot of them out there being abused, and they figured out how to make them break less. And the beauty of a Powerglide is it's really easy to fix. It is, if you're going to rebuild your first transmission, Powerglide's not a bad place to start because there's not that many parts and it's not really complicated. So, small sidebar, the enemy of rebuilt transmissions or transmission parts, this transmission specialty shaft in that plastic bag has no coating on it. It's bare metal. It's starting to rust. I'm glad I took it out for this video because now I can stop that, get the little, you know, cuff off a little bit of rust with a Scotch-Brite pad, put some oil on it, put it back in the bag. This is my brand new 10 clutch JW high clutch drum for my transmission. It's starting to rust. So I'm really careful. I keep a spray bottle of WD-40 or CRC 336, something that will, this 336 is meant to kind of dry on it and be a rust preventer. That's how I assemble my transmissions, unless I know it's going right back in service tomorrow or whenever they get it back. If they're not stomping their feet waiting for it, I'm going to coat all the parts to keep it from rusting. So the other Powerglide that's here to be repaired, this is the third time I've had it apart in so many years. The first 2 times, there was some torque converter swapping going on, and it got full of metal, but I took it apart and inspected everything. The metal didn't come from the transmission. That's how you can tell. You take it apart, and if nothing in the transmission has been grinding on itself, it has to come from an outside source. The torque converter mostly, or the cooler circuit, or whatever. So, twice before, this beautiful, expensive Ringless shaft Powerglide, so we're talking one that can hold, 1,500 and up horsepower, is getting infusions of metal grit through it, which is certainly not good for it. Got a call this summer, wanted to drop it off again because there's metal in the pan. So this time, the metal came from within, and the inner pump gear has been forced into the back of the pump. The witness marks are there, it lines up perfect. There's only one thing that causes that. Improper torque converter spacing. It's the simplest of concepts, it seems, and I watch it discussed on all the internet forums. And somehow, I've tried 3 or 4 times to talk about it. And again, the message isn't that clear. But in the simplest of terms, when you have the torque converter shoved all the way in the transmission, and you bolt it up to your engine, and you look at the gap between the pads on the torque converter where it bolts up and the pad on the flex plate where it joins, I use a drill bit to measure. But you need a minimum of 1/8 of an inch and no more than 3/16. That's 0.125 to 0.187. Just stick a drill bit in there. You don't move anything, you're not shimming anything, you're just checking the gap. If you have that gap, you're good to pull the torque converter ahead and bolt it up. What you're doing is pulling the pump gear away from the back of the pump. You've only got these 2 little teeth for the lugs on the torque converter to engage into, so you can't come out too far, but you don't want to be pushing in on it. You don't want to squish it. It needs room to grow and flex. The flex plate flexes. When it's going like this, you don't want the pump gear banging into the back of the pump. If you have a larger gap than 1.125 to 0.187, you need a shim that will land you with the gap you need. So I see people say that if there's a, they bolt it up and there's a gap, they're going to put a shim in it. No, you just shimmed it tight, and this is what happens. You've ruined an expensive pump. It was a ringless pump, which is different. We just went over that. It's all welded. This is throwaway now. It's probably gouged too deep to be able to face it. It's been faced before, I think. And at some point, it's too far. So I ended up buying a new pump. Yes, new. I believe it's offshore. It's an FTI, ringless. And the beauty of the fact they use a Turbo 400 stator bushing, they're kind of universal. You got to be careful because they don't talk about the size of their bushings. I even called FTI. They had to put me through to the building department, and the guy was pretty sure it was a Turbo 400 stator bushing. Might have got the wrong guy. I went ahead and bought it. And when I got it, I just had to do some minor sizing. I was happy with the way this spun. It had a tight spot, but it was the correct size. They are TH400 stator bushings in the back. And the aftermarket pumps have more bolts holding the halves together. They also have one pilot stud. So when you line it up, I still put my clamps around it to a dowel pin, if you will. I still put my hose clamps around it when I tighten the bolts to put the halves together, but if they had 2 dowels, you might not have to do that. Maybe the one's supposed to do it, but I wasn't trusting that it, it's a simple matter to put my hose clamp around it while I tighten the bolts so it fits into the case and the halves are in alignment. So that's today's nuggets. This is a shame. Hopefully, it doesn't happen again. This poor Powerglide has been living in gritty oil for 2 or 3 years now, and it's got to take its toll on the planetaries, everything else. And cleaning out the metal, I have to take everything apart because it's like liquid never sees. Hours and hours of cleaning parts, and not my favorite thing to do. Oh, and when this lost pressure, it smoked the high clutches. Bad. So that is what it is, and I'll fix it and send it back. So have a great day. Enjoy your Saturday. Take her easy.